In 2016, director Martin Scorsese and star Andrew Garfield gave the world a prolonged examination of the role of suffering in faith.
In 2022, Kentucky Owl gives us the first of two new budget expressions.
The film is Silence,
The whiskey is the Wiseman Rye.
and we'll review them both. This is
The Film and Whiskey Podcast. Welcome to the Film and Whiskey Podcast, where each week we review a classic movie and a glass of whiskey. I'm Bob Book.
I'm Brad G.
And you're doing the accent of everyone in this movie, Brad. Because this week we're looking at
It's
2016's Silence, a movie full of terrible accents.
Just the worst. And to be clear, I think as I said that, I realized that I might have sounded like I was imitating a Japanese accent. I was not trying to do that. I was trying to joke about the fact that Adam Driver and Liam Neeson and Andrew Garfield cannot do a Portuguese accent to save their lives.
Nope, not at all. Not at all.
It's so bad.
Yeah, let's just get that out of the way now. So, I like this movie a lot, Brad. And
Yes.
obviously,
Yep.
I think, we've actually been talking about this movie for many years on the podcast because when we first started the show, episode 1 of Film and Whiskey is Goodfellas. And you said on that podcast...
Who directed that movie?
Right? You said on that podcast that the only Scorsese movie you had seen up to that point was Silence. So,
Yeah.
your introduction to Scorsese was perhaps the least stereotypically Scorsese film there is in terms of content and rhythm.
Well, it was really funny. So the reason I saw Silence, one of my absolute best friends in the world, Matt Cowman, he lives out in St. Louis. He was visiting me while we were both in seminary. And we were just had a group of friends over because I wanted my friends to meet my buddy that I lived with in Philly. And we were hanging out. We had dinner. We, had a few drinks. And we were like, let's watch a movie. And Matt was like, yeah, I heard about this movie called Silence. It's about these Jesuit missionaries to Japan. I'm really interested in it. I want to watch it. And so everybody in the group was like, well, we're going to let the guest pick the movie.
Yikes.
I'll just say this. In a group of 8 to 10 people, Silence is not necessarily the movie to watch.
Classic party movie, Silence. Followed, you could do a back-to-back viewing and then just throw on Schindler's List right afterwards.
Yeah.
Rip roaring good times.
We were weeping halfway through the movie. So yeah, that was my introduction to the illustrious world of Martin Scorsese.
So I also saw this movie while we were in seminary. And, of course, I had been keeping tabs on it because Scorsese, this project had been gestating in the mind of Scorsese for decades. He wanted to make it in the 80s, didn't have the funding, set it aside, came back to it, set it aside again, and then he makes The Wolf of Wall Street. And he's like, it's probably time for me to do Silence. I think the man needed a reset. He finally does Silence, and it comes out with just a thud. I don't know what happened. I'm trying to figure out if the studio just decided this is not really going to work. I know that he delivered it at the very last minute, and so it wasn't really an awards contender. It does get nominated for best cinematography, but that's it. And you'd think that a Scorsese movie would have more oomph behind it, but this movie kind of got dumped in theaters, and it didn't come out wide until January. And the closest it was playing to us when we lived in Kentucky was Cincinnati. And so I drove an hour and a half to go see this movie, partially because there were a number of people that went to seminary with us that were also familiar with the fact that this movie was coming out. And as seminary bros are wont to do, they already had opinions on the content of the movie, having not seen it. And I was like, for the love of God, I'm going to at least go see this movie before I form my opinion on it. So, like, I knew I was the only person at Asbury Seminary that had driven an hour and a half to go see this movie that was released in like 5 theaters. So it was nice to at least know who was talking out of their butt and who was not. And that's my experience with Silence.
First off, I'm okay with not being at seminary anymore, Bob.
Dude, me too.
The life of seminary bros was a little bit tiresome, if I'm being honest. Secondly, I love your commitment to being right.
You know, it's not even like that I want to be right. It's just that I want to speak from an informed place.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like,
it's worrisome that so many people in seminary don't care about that.
That's 100% the case. Yeah. Well, in the spirit of being informed, Brad and I have both seen Silence now multiple times. We're going to talk through the whole thing, performances, the direction. I want to talk about the pacing of the movie a bit, because having seen it now for a second time, Brad, I hadn't watched it since the theater. I do think this movie is a little slow. I do think this movie is not perfect, but we have a very particular attachment to and lens to view this movie from. And so I think we're going to have a really good discussion on this today. But before we start all that, it's time for us to throw over to Brad Explains, which is America's favorite segment. This is the part of the podcast where Brad breaks down the plot of the film that he has just seen, often for the first time. This is not Brad's first time seeing Silence, so let's just get that clear. However, it is a 3-hour-long movie, and we're only giving you 60 seconds to break down the plot of it. Brad, do you think you can do it?
All right, I think this movie comes in 3 parts. There's the opening when Andrew Garfield and Adam Driver are Jesuit priests. They find out that their mentor has apostatized, which you will probably hear that word a lot, means that they recanted their faith or basically said, I'm not a Christian anymore. So they go to Japan. Second part of the movie is them ministering to basically an underground church that is being repressed by the Japanese government at the time. And then the third part of the movie is when they are captured, and it follows Andrew Garfield, who eventually recants his faith and becomes a Christian rooter-outer for the Japanese government. And then he dies. And he was still a Christian?
Question mark? Yeah.
See what I did there?
So this movie does a lot of things really well, and it does a lot of things not so well. I'll say that now. Right? A couple days ago, Brad, I made a spreadsheet that I don't know what I'm going to do with yet, but I put every movie we've ever reviewed on the podcast in one spreadsheet. And Nice. It has our scores and it has the IMDb score. And I am fairly certain that Silence is either the lowest or the second lowest rated movie on IMDb that we have ever done on this podcast.
Really?
Yeah, I think it was like Elizabethtown and then Silence is like right above it.
So, I was literally thinking, I was like, it beat Elizabethtown? This is a better movie than Elizabethtown.
Oh, for sure. It's a better movie than a lot of films we've done on this podcast. But it has a 7.1 on IMDb with 112,000 reviews. So it's not like it's an unseen movie. I do think that a lot of that is that people have an idea in their mind of what a quote unquote Scorsese film is. And then they go into this movie and it is very much a Scorsese film. It has all the themes that his, gangster movies have. It's just not a gangster movie. And it's a very slow paced examination of torture and like spiritual anguish. But people probably went into this expecting something a little different than what they got. And I have to imagine that at least part of this score is that they were just let down, that there wasn't enough bloodletting in the movie.
Yeah, I'd be curious if this movie was given a reset and like had an opportunity to re-examine its score with people who have sat with the movie for years. I wonder if it would get, maybe like a 7.4 or 7.5. I will say, when you said second lowest, I wasn't expecting a 7.1. I feel like there has to be more movies in like the high 6 to low 7 range than that we've reviewed.
Yeah, surprisingly not.
Man, that's impressive. Come on.
All right, so let's talk the movie. I guess I want to start with the performances. Andrew Garfield is in every scene or nearly every scene in this movie. And
Yeah.
I actually think he's quite good. Andrew Garfield is one of my favorite actors working today. I thought he should have won the Oscar last year for his performance in the movie Tick, Tick, Boom. It was fantastic. He had a great year last year. And he's really, really good here. Like, I feel like people are finally coming around to Andrew Garfield as the incredible actor that he is. But from the time I first encountered him, which was in The Social Network in 2010, you know, by the time he gets here, it's 2016. He's in the midst of making all these terrible Spider-Man movies, and he goes off and does this Scorsese film. Aside from the fact that his accent is really not good, I think the performance itself is pretty spectacular. It's an anguished, internalized and then externalized, you know, like putting him through the ringer kind of a performance, and I think he really nails it, Brad.
Well, and this movie is one that relies a lot on narration. And with Garfield as the primary narrator, there's a certain beauty to voice acting where you are not on screen, but your voice is, that a lot of people really don't appreciate. You know, like we've said it on the podcast before many times that Tom Hanks talks about how acting for Toy Story, he's like exhausted at the end of the day, you know, because he's in the booth giving it his all. And I think that can be the case here as well. I think you see Garfield really pouring his heart out on camera and, you know, just vocally. And it's really noticeable, Bob.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I want to press you a little bit, though. Like, what did you think about the performance itself?
I think that he does a really great job of using his body to express where he's at. That earlier in the film, he's a lot more open and he's a lot more like his body physically is more open to the peasants. And as you get later in the film, he's a lot more hunched up, curled in on himself. Like as he gets angry with Liam Neeson, you can see him like physically wanting to lash out. And so I think the physicality of his performance is something that I really loved.
Yeah. There's something about his character, and it's pretty obvious, but there are moments in the movie where you can tell that Scorsese and the original author of the Silence novel are using the character of Rodriguez, Garfield, to kind of explore themes of like what Jesus went through, right? And Scorsese did this himself in his movie, The Last Temptation of Christ, but it's not using the character of Jesus to examine some of these things. It's using somebody who acts as a representative of Jesus, which gives it this other layer of kind of emotional torment because he knows what he's called to do. He also knows what he's taken a pledge to do in terms of like protecting his flock. And the pull between like staying faithful to confessing Jesus and preserving the life and well-being of the people that are in his care, I think it's this beautiful and really tortuous kind of like interplay. But what I love, what I really like about what they do with his character, like I said, is like they do kind of make him an what's the word? Like an analog for Jesus in a lot of ways, because as he gets closer to what you know is going to be the crisis point where he's going to have to either apostatize or confess, it's very similar to like what I would imagine the story of Jesus is like as he gets closer to the cross. And you have this character who is a very Judas-like character who keeps coming in and keeps betraying him and then keeps crawling back and asking for forgiveness. And you start to see the anger and the resentment rise up inside of Andrew Garfield towards this guy. And it's like, do I do what I know is right, which is to forgive this guy repeatedly? Or do I let my sort of human emotions that are very real and very valid take over? And I love that they're kind of examining the story of Jesus through this guy.
Bro, I think that Kichijiro is like the crux of this movie.
For sure.
Like from the moment he comes on screen as this just absolutely drunken, I don't know what the right word to use, like imbecile. Like the way they portray him at the start is such a broken man that you see as he engages with his faith, he comes back to a renewal of faith, but he has that line where he says like, what am I supposed to do in a world like this? Like, why couldn't I have been born to a different age where I could have lived my whole life as a happy old Christian and just died as an old man? Why did I have to live in such a difficult time? And man, if that is not like reflective of so many Christians' existence, where whatever they are struggling with, they would ask that question like, man, why am I having to struggle with this in this time? And the way that Andrew Garfield responds to him throughout the movie, it's just heart-wrenching and touching and sad and just all sorts of emotions. And I really think that that's where this movie works the best for me, as far as like causing a moral quandary and tension within my soul.
Oh, for
which
sure.
is like the whole point of this movie.
There's like 4 or 5 different subplots that are all designed to cause that tension. And I think we'll get into all of them. But I want to steer into the rest of the cast real quick, because I feel like, Brad, 75% of our show today is just going to be us talking about these moral quandaries. So like, let's at least get the camera work and the actors out of the way here.
Let's drive in a new direction.
Hey, Adam Driver plays Father Garupe. And again, this is Adam Driver coming off of HBO's Girls, when he's finally, like, he's first starting to kind of blow up. This comes out, I think, the year following The Force Awakens, when the rest of the world became aware of who Adam Driver was. He's so freaking good in this movie, Brad. But even here, you can tell that people hadn't quite turned over the reins to him the way that, you know, when we watched Marriage Story, and he's like, clearly him and Scarlett Johansson are the 2 main figures of that movie. I think he's good here, but he's really not in the movie that much.
No, he's not. I think that Adam Driver should have been the lead in this.
Oh, interesting.
I just genuinely think he is a better actor than Andrew Garfield, just across the board. And I think he would have handled the introspective nature of it better. There's certain parts of the film where Garfield, he just comes across as kind of corny in certain elements.
Interesting.
And I think that Adam Driver just has like this panache that would give him a little bit of an upper hand as Father Rodriguez instead of Garupe.
So here's the thing. I think I disagree with you. And it's because, and I don't know if it's because what you're saying is like, Andrew Garfield has some limitations as an actor, but I think if he does, it works in his favor here, because you believe that he has a zeal for what he's doing, but you never quite know if the character of Rodriguez totally believes what he's telling people. And I think that really helps play into the character as he goes along. You know, there's this one part of the movie where Garfield's character gets kind of rounded up with a bunch of other local Christians, and they're kind of sitting around, and one of them offers him something to drink or something to eat, and he snaps at her. And it's the first time that as a priest, you see him just be a jerk to somebody. And all the other Christians around kind of realize like, oh, this guy might not be exactly who he thinks he is or who he says he is. And I wonder if you put Driver in that role, I don't know if it works as well, because he's so good at convincing you that he believes what he's saying on screen. And so I feel like having that kind of dodginess to him actually like improves Garfield's character.
I mean, maybe you're right, man. I guess I just looked at it plain and simple as like, I just think Adam Driver is the better actor in this film. And so from that level, I'm like, yeah, sure, he probably would have pulled it off better. But you're the cinephile here, so I'll trust your opinion on it.
No, I'm just saying, like, I like where they're at in this movie. However, there is somebody else we need to talk about here.
My boy, he got taken by the Japanese.
He got taken. Liam Neeson. That famous Portuguese man, Liam Neeson.
Liam Neeson was such a terrible casting choice.
Here's the thing, though. He's really good. He just doesn't even attempt to be Portuguese. In the very first scene, he's kind of like doing a like mildly offensive, like Latino inflected accent. And then
Latino adjacent.
Right. And then in the second time he shows up, he's like, hey, I'm Irish now. And he just does Liam Neeson. And I think the dialogue in that scene is so good. And Neeson does such a good job of presenting it so matter-of-factly that I really love his performance. But you're right, man. Like, literally any actor from Portugal or Spain or surrounding regions probably would have been a little bit of a better choice.
Yeah, I think my issue is it's kind of like an Interstellar Matt Damon reveal where I know that you see Liam Neeson early in the film, so you know that he's in the movie, but like you have time with Andrew Garfield and with Adam Driver to get used to them being, Portuguese priests that are going into Japan. Like you spend the whole movie with them. Whereas by the time you get back to Liam Neeson, he's still Liam Neeson. You know what I mean? Like it'd be like if Tom Hanks was in the role. He would still be Tom Hanks at that point of the movie. Like anytime you have a famous actor in a role, in my opinion at least, they need to be in the entire movie because I need a little bit of time to get used to them not just being Matthew McConaughey or Tom Cruise or, whomever. And so when Liam Neeson comes back on screen, I'm just like, oh, he has a special set of skills, and he's also a Jedi Master, and he's also Aslan. He's a big lion, and so I really struggled with the casting choice of Liam Neeson, and I'll agree with you. Like he killed it in his scenes, but yeah, I think they could have gotten somebody a little less famous.
All right, so this movie is nominated, like I said, for Best Cinematography. The camera work in this movie is just spectacular.
Chef's kiss.
I mean, like perfect. Rodrigo Prieto is the cinematographer here. I mean, the color palette, the mist and the fog, and then like the striking kind of more warm and saturated tones when they get in that house where Liam Neeson is staying, just to kind of signify like the luxury that he's living in. I mean, like it's really subtle, but it is framed so every frame in this movie could be like a painting that you hang. It's just beautiful.
Yeah, and every single time they like are getting out of a boat and like fighting the shore to get onto land, they just have these beautiful wide like panoramic shots where you can see how little the priests are against this backdrop of Japan. Mm-hmm. And it serves to undergird the purpose of the movie, which is to show Christianity is so small in the face of Japanese power. Mm-hmm. And so I think that the cinematography, like, it lays the foundation for the message of the movie in such a beautiful way. And a lot of movies just don't do that.
Yeah. All right, before we go to break, Brad, I want to finish out talking about the qualities of the filmmaking and the film as a film, right? Like we're going to get into the themes and we're going to grapple, I think, a little bit with how do you separate out the filmmaking from what the film is trying to say? And I'll say this, I'm not going to give this movie a 10 out of 10. I don't know if you are, but I do think this movie is flawed. I still really like it. And I think it gets at a lot of things that many movies don't. But if I'm being frank here, it's a 3-hour long movie. Or actually, it's only like 2 hours and 40 minutes. It feels longer than 3 hours.
Yes.
I don't know if I could actually pinpoint a scene or scenes that I think should be cut completely. Like, it seems like everything has its place here. It's really long and it feels really long. And it's kind of repetitive. Like, it's very cyclical, the story that it tells. And so I feel like it needs to be shorter, but I can't necessarily offer, here's what you should cut. You know what I mean?
Here's the thing, Bob. This movie feels really long and drawn out. And this is one of the only movies where I'm like, oh, it's to emphasize the struggle and the pain that Andrew Garfield is going through.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like you can't have this movie be like a tight 2 hours and 10 minutes.
Right.
Like, it needs the amount of time it has to breathe life into the suffering and anguish that is going on for Garfield that he experienced over a long period of time.
Yep.
And so I'm with you. It's slow. There's moments that are boring. There's moments where you're just like, oh man, this is taking forever to get anywhere. But weirdly, I'm okay with it. Well, I mean, I'm not the person to normally say that.
No, but I think weirdly, this movie and Wolf of Wall Street are actually really interesting companion films in Scorsese's catalog because he does the exact same thing with Wolf of Wall Street. Like, that is a 3-hour long movie, And it's 3 hours long for a reason. Like, it is an exhausting movie to sit through.
Mm-hmm.
And it's because, like, it is trying to have the effect on you that the drugs are having on Jordan Belfort in that movie.
Mm-hmm.
And it is this, like, over-the-top, maximalized, satire. And it's very similar to, like, I don't know if in high school if you ever read any selections from the book Don Quixote, but, like, Don Quixote was written specifically to parody other really long and lengthy hero stories of the time.
Mm-hmm.
And, like, Miguel de Cervantes, like, wrote that book in the most long-winded way just to, like, on all the stupid stories he didn't like. And it's really funny when you know that. And I think that's what he's doing with Wolf of Wall Street. And in another way that is, like, much more serious, he's doing that with Silence. You're right. Like, this movie has to be shaggy, and it has to be repetitive, and it has to be cyclical, and it has to kind of get annoying and get on your nerves a little bit. I think this is the best version of this story. I still don't think it's like a perfect, you know what I mean? Like, I just don't know if this movie was ever going to be a 10 out of 10, even if it does everything it's supposed to do.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that Scorsese was worried about this being a 10 out of 10.
Sure.
Like, I think that he wanted to honor his Catholic faith with a really fascinating story in, the history of Catholicism goes back 2,000 years. Like, it's really hard for Americans to understand because, like, the oldest things we have are on the East Coast from, like, the mid to late 1600s. And that's it. And even that's like 300 plus years ago. With Catholicism, we're talking about 2,000 years of history. And so for him to, like, take a small little piece of that and examine it with this near 3-hour movie, like, he wasn't trying to make a perfect movie. I think he just really was interested in these big life questions that Catholicism deals with. Like, why do we suffer as humans? What is the point of suffering? Is there a place where suffering is not healthy? Like, Christianity deals with all these questions about, like, suffering for your faith. Well, at what point does it become worthless to suffer for your faith and you're actually suffering for your own pride? Like, he's jumping into all these questions, and I don't think he gave a rip that this, flopped at the box office. Like, he got to make it and he's happy, Yep.
Yeah, totally agree, man. All right, well, it's going to fall down to us, Brad, to answer the questions of why do we suffer and why are we here. But in order to answer those profound questions,
we need whiskey.
We need whiskey, man. Let's pivot into trying this Wiseman Rye. What do you say?
Let's get to it, Bob. Lately, I've been finding myself pulling whiskeys off the shelf that are consistently unique, ones that tell a good story every time I pop the cork, and I have to say that Doc Swinson's is absolutely top tier when it comes to a fascinating pour. What separates Doc Swinson's from the rest of the pack is their unrelenting goal of always letting the whiskey shine. No matter what whiskey comes through the front door at Doc's, their team of tasters will blend and finish it into something that is deliciously memorable. The beautiful thing about a good blended whiskey is that oftentimes, with proper care and attention, they turn into a whiskey that is truly greater than the sum of their parts. Whether you're trying their alter ego, blender's cut, or exploratory series, you are guaranteed to have a phenomenal experience with Doc Swinson's whiskey. You can find them online at docswhiskey.com. That's DOCS whiskey.com.
All right, so today we are checking out the Wiseman Rye. Brad, before we even get into that, I have to offer a quick correction to last week's episode. Every now and then we get on a little bit of a spiel and we misspeak. Apparently, I misspoke pretty heavily last week on our Jack Daniels Bonded episode because I've had multiple people write in to tell me, like, hey, you're very wrong about this. Which I seriously appreciate. And I think the best distillation, I see what you did there, of what we got wrong comes from our friend Zach Johnston at Uprocks. He wrote to us today and he said, hey guys, I love what you're doing. 2 quick corrections for the last episode. All Tennessee whiskey is bourbon. It's a subcategory both by definition and legally. So I know that we said, hey, Tennessee whiskey is not bourbon. I said that in part because, like, they tried to position themselves as not bourbon, but it's important to note legally, like by every classification, it is bourbon that has undergone this filtration process that, they talk about in Tennessee. Zach says the rules are literally copied from the bourbon ones, and the legal trade category for Tennessee whiskey is bourbon. It's the same thing, except for that Lincoln County process of sugar maple charcoal filtering. That said, most bourbon is also filtered in one way or another, so the filtering of Tennessee whiskey doesn't disqualify it from being a bourbon. Also, we said that Jack Daniel's Bonded was a completely new product. That's also not entirely true. It was an international product that was kind of sold at like duty-free stores or in airports. So it's just hitting U.S. shelves for the first time, but they launched it as a Jack Daniel's Traveler's exclusive bottled in bond, which has been around since 2018. So Zach and others, thank you for the correction. We really appreciate it.
You're just such an arrogant American, Bob, to assume that when whiskey hits the shelves here, it's the first time it's ever hit the shelves.
I will say, I'll take the opportunity to say, part of what we do here on the show is we try to present things as the common person, right? And like every once in a while, we'll hear from a PR person and they'll send us a sell sheet and a press release that goes really heavily in detail on the whiskeys that we're drinking. So we have all the information. A lot of times, though, what we do is what anybody at home would do is we pick something up at the liquor store, we type it into Google and we say like, the Wiseman Rye review. And we look up from these pretty reputable sources, like what they have said about the whiskey. And in some cases, we've gotten a few corrections over the years that we only said what we saw in these reputable sources. And so sometimes it's just a breakdown of communication where like, hey, we didn't know this about the whiskey, but that also reflects the fact that the average person wouldn't know this about this whiskey.
Yeah. I was going to say, Bob, 100%. As far as the first fact that we got wrong last week, I had no idea. I genuinely thought that Tennessee sour mash whiskey was not bourbon. So that's news to me, man.
All right, so let's transition into this Wiseman Rye. This is a new brand from Kentucky Owl. And I said at the top of the episode that it's a budget brand. It's not really a budget brand. It's still like $50+.
I was about to say.
Right, but
it's only budget compared to their normal
to
stuff.
Kentucky Owl. So this is a 95% rye mash bill. But Brad, it is not an MGP product. This is not originating in Indiana. This is a Kentucky distilled 95.5 rye mash bill.
I thought that MGP had like the trademark on 95% rye. Like nobody else was allowed to do it.
Well, we shall see. It clocks in at 100.8 proof. And Brad, I gotta say, man, it has a very pleasant nose.
Yeah, it's a little bit dusty. There's some brown sugar going on. It's buttery. And then like about halfway through the nosing experience, boom, like all that strong rye that you're looking for. I'm pretty impressed with this, Bob. I'm not going to go crazy high, but I'll give it an 8 out of 10.
Yeah, I'm going to do the same, Brad. Like, this is a very rye-heavy rye on the nose and really herbaceous. Lots of mint, lots of dill on this one. There's a little bit of caramel kind of underlying it all, and every once in a while you'll get like the barrel notes as well. But for the most part, it smells like walking through a garden. Like, it's really herbaceous. I like it a lot. I'm going to give it an 8 out of 10.
Yeah, and I think as you get into the actual palate, it drops off a little bit from the nose, not too far, but for me, I got like a little bit of a raisin flavor, a lot of the rye spice, and some of that brown sugar coming through. And normally whiskeys get oaky kind of on the back end near the finish. This one for me felt oaky almost on the tip of my tongue. So there's definitely some of that wood character coming through here.
Yeah, Brad, I'm with you. The flavor is interesting. There's definitely there's like a raisiny note on this, and it's not a sweet one. It almost reminds me kind of like prune juice a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
I like it, though. It gets a little bit thin on the mouthfeel for me. Like the front half of the palate, it's there. It's a nice kind of honeyed sweetness. You get a lot of that kind of raw rye grain. You get some of that raisin or prune. And then when you go to swallow, it makes itself known, but it's just a very thin kind of back end of the palate into the finish. I'm going to give this a 7 out of 10 on the palate.
Yeah, I'm actually right there with you, Bob. I'm going to give it a 7 out of 10 as well. I think that the finish picks up a little bit. For me, that honey really came through on the finish. after I had drank it and swallowed it, sat on my palate for a little bit, and I was like, oh, there's a little bit of honey going on. But the other parts of the finish, lots of oak, lots of really nice, complex rye spices. It almost has a little bit of a clove feel to it. I like the finish. I'll give it a 7.5 out of 10.
I can't quite put my finger on which kind of herb this reminds me of most. It's not super minty, but it also doesn't really tip into that dill side too heavily. But after you swallow, there is a lot of, I don't even want to call it graininess, because it's not just rye grain, but there is like an undistinguishable like herb here. Are you picking it up here? Like what is it that I'm getting on the finish here?
I honestly don't know, Bob. I didn't get many herbs on this at all. For me, the most unique note throughout was that kind of raisin prune juice. Mm-hmm. So I'm not really getting the herbaceous feel.
It definitely doesn't tip into like a bitter oakiness, but it kind of goes a little bit sour. And I think that's why it's reminding me of some sort of herb or plant. I like this still, Brad, but I think the finish is where it kind of starts to go south a little bit for me. I think I'm only going to give it a 6.5 on the finish.
Yeah, and that jumps us into balance. Honestly, it's like a pretty well-balanced whiskey. Like, it all around, it has some interesting flavors. It's averagely complex, but like nothing about it really stands out. So I think I'm going to give it a 7 out of 10 on balance.
I'm going to go ahead and give it a 7.5. And I will say that this is my second time trying it. I tried it about 2 weeks ago, and it was really delicious when I first popped the cork. Really sweet, almost like a very bourbon-y rye, and I really, really liked that. Now that it's sat for a couple weeks, it has a completely different character to me. And it may just be me. It may be that I ate something different today and that my palate's just thrown off. But this is a very different drinking experience today than it was 2 weeks ago for me. So I'm going to try to walk the line between those two experiences, and I'm going to give it a 7.5 on balance.
Yeah, and that brings us to our value. Robert, this is a $50 bottle of whiskey, as we mentioned before. Definitely a lot cheaper than other options from Kentucky Owl, but $50 is nothing to sneeze at, man.
Yeah, and I actually see that it's selling for like up to $60 in some places, and I would not recommend it at that price. But let's just say $50 as SRP here. I don't think it's a terrible value, and ryes are still kind of slept on in the marketplace, and they're not making enough of them. I would love to see as much variance and availability of different products in the rye world as we do in the bourbon world. So I think I'm more willing to spend $50 on a rye than I am on a bourbon, just because there's not as many things to pick up. That said, I mean, it's not a great value. If this was $35, I'd be like, oh yeah, good value. At $50, I'm just going to give it a 6 out of 10.
Yeah, I'm right there with you, Bob. 6 out of 10 on the value. I almost want to give it a 5. I'll stick with a 6. It's a decent value, but honestly, it needs to be like a $38 bottle of whiskey.
All right, so Brad, what are you coming out to?
I'm at a 35.5.
I am at a 35.0, so we're coming out to a 35.25 out of 50, or a 70.5 out of 100. We are just at that point where we would normally start recommending to try or to buy. I would say go ahead and give this a try at the bar. Like, I don't think a pour would cost you that much. It's probably going to be about $10 for a pour. It's decent. Like, it's pretty good. I just don't know if I would say pull the trigger on a $50 bottle of it.
Yeah, I think the thing for me is it's not unique enough to make me want to spend $50 or even $10. I don't know. I don't think I'm going to recommend buy or try.
Wow.
To be honest.
I'll recommend try, but not buy. So we have another expression of this coming up next week. It is the Wiseman Bourbon. So we'll give that one a try as we kick off next week's miniseries. But Brad, let's get back into talking about silence. What do you say?
Suffering. Today's sponsor is a little bit of a departure from our usual area of expertise, and man, oh man, I was blown away by their product once we received it. I am talking about Manscaped. Now, if you're like me at all, you've probably seen the Manscaped ads and kind of wondered to yourself, like, do I really need like some sort of specialty trimmer to take care of my downstairs business? And I've just got to be honest, I was absolutely wrong. Their trimmer is called the Lawnmower 4.0. And I gotta say, it is the Rolls Royce of trimmers. It's got a ceramic blade that reduces grooming mishaps, a wireless charging base, and an awesome flashlight that keeps things illuminated while you're working. And beyond all that, it's waterproof. This thing is really changing the game when it comes to below-the-belt hygiene. Now, this is just me talking about my experience, but this trimmer really is way beyond anything I've ever used to keep things neat and tidy. You can use our discount code FILMWHISKEY to get 20% off your order and free shipping. Head on over to manscaped.com and use code FILMWHISKEY to get 20% off, free shipping, and you will be well on your way to hygiene heaven. All right, everybody, that was Wiseman Rye, a whiskey that was like it was a solid expression of rye, but didn't really have anything that stood out about it, Bob.
Yeah, I feel it, man.
Yeah. You know what does have something that stands out, Bob? 2 facts and a falsehood.
2 facts and a falsehood.
Canada's favorite segment.
This is where Brad tries pretty successfully to stump me. I think I'm sitting at like 2-4 on the season right now. I'll have to go back and check my record, but like not off to a good start with this season, Brad. For me, at least.
Yeah, it's a little rough for you, man. I would say I'm feeling it for you, but I'm just sitting happy, man.
Yeah, you're succeeding
over here.
You're winning at life right now.
I feel great.
All right, Brad.
Just know that your failure brings me great joy. If that helps.
That's like the theme of silence. My failure gives you life.
Yeah, it does.
All right, man. Hit me with these 3 supposed facts, one of which is false.
Fact number 1. This is the first film for Adam Driver since Midnight Special, also released in 2016, and he lost over 40 pounds for the role of Garupe. Fact number 2. Daniel Day-Lewis and Liam Neeson replaced each other in projects that were both stuck in development for years. Neeson was supposed to play Abraham Lincoln, and Daniel Day-Lewis was supposed to play Father Ferreira. But when Neeson dropped out of Lincoln, Daniel Day-Lewis replaced him, and later, Neeson was chosen as Father Ferreira. Fact number 3. Shinya Tsukamoto, who played Mokichi in the film, is a huge fan of Martin Scorsese and, immediately applied for the role when the casting call went out. But Scorsese was, wildly confused when the application, reached his desk because he was questioning if this was really the director of Tetsuo, the Iron Man from 1989 that wanted to act in his film.
Wow, I have no idea. I am pretty sure that Adam Driver had 3 or 4 movies come out in 2016. Midnight Special, which is a pretty good movie. And then he had one that was called Patterson. And then he had this one. So I know he lost a ton of weight, but I don't know if you're trying to trick me with this is his first movie since Midnight Special. But unless you're trying to get me on a technicality, I'm going to say 1 is true. 2, I think, is also true because I remember when they were developing the Lincoln Project with Liam Neeson, and then it pivoted over to Daniel Day-Lewis. So 3 seems to me to be the falsehood, but I have no idea. I don't know anything about what you're saying with number 3. So you could be trying to trick me. I'm going to hope that you're not being super nitpicky about number 1 and the movies that Adam Driver made in 2016. And I'm going to say 3 is the falsehood.
Yeah, I'm being a little bit nitpicky, Bob.
Oh, come on, man.
He lost over 60 pounds for the role, and this was not his first movie since Driver since Midnight.
Dude, I thought you said you were never going to do it like this when you drafted up your questions.
I wasn't. I guess I'll say this. As I was drafting this question, I didn't think I was being super nitpicky. But
do we know the order they were filmed in? Maybe this was his first movie since Midnight Special.
I don't know about order it was filmed in. Order of release was Driver Since Midnight, Patterson, and then Silence.
This seems very nitpicky. I will also say that if he lost over 60 pounds, that also means that he lost over 40 pounds.
He still did lose over 40 pounds.
That's that correct. Question of how many months have 28 days, and it's all of them.
All of them.
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, that's somebody asked me the other day, how do you pronounce the capital of Kentucky? Is it Louisville or Louisville? And I told him it's Frankfurt.
Yeah.
And he was like, you're the first person who ever got that. Everybody else gets it wrong.
I don't know if I want to take the L on this, man. Like, I knew what the 3 movies were.
I think we should arm wrestle.
I think we should leave it up to our patrons.
Okay.
Let's see what they say.
Yeah, I'm in.
All right,
patrons,
man.
What are your thoughts?
What do you think? Did Brad get me or not?
Did I do him dirty?
All right, man, let's get back into talking about silence. I think it is time for us to kind of dive into some of the deeper themes here. Brad, I sent you an article before we recorded this, and it was in the New York Times a couple weeks ago. And it was really beautiful. It was a podcast that the New York Times does. And I was reading the transcript of this podcast, and it was an interview with a pastor who had experienced like significant trauma and burnout as a result of pastoring through the pandemic and also through the politicization of America over the last 5 years, 6 years. And there's a quote in that article that I want to read, and I think it's going to kind of frame my take on this movie for the rest of the episode. So in this story, the pastor's talking about how they had gone through this big vote for something as a church, and they had really done everything they could to make it as transparent as possible and give people a voice. And then the vote went one way, and everybody who disagreed, you know, like gave the pastor a bunch of crap. They got on social media. They had like a whole group of people basically saying that like this pastor is a bad leader and bad mouthing him publicly because, you know, the church decided democratically to do something. And this is what he says. He says, and I realized at that moment that being a pastor is this really precarious little spot you sit in, that people project all of their wants and needs and demands, expectations, unrealized hopes onto you. But when you don't meet them, they're posed with a response. Either they're going to reject you or ruin you or abandon you. And Brad, I think we're at a really interesting place in the history of American Christianity, where you're seeing pastors drop out of the ministry, like at an alarming rate. And it's a result of the tension of trying to, I don't want to say please people, but keep, you know, their flock, for lack of a better term, like satisfied and engaged, and also experiencing the trauma and the burnout of losing people and having people burn you. And I watched this movie, and that's not necessarily what's happening to Andrew Garfield's character. But what really moved me this time around wasn't the theological, like, is he doing the right thing? Is he actually listening to the doctrines that the church has historically held? Is he a heretic? The thing that really moved me was watching this through the lens of a pastor, because I think that this movie might be the best depiction I've ever seen of what it means to be a pastor. Like, Andrew Garfield is wrestling on the daily in this movie. Like, do I heed the words that I know to be true in scripture, where Jesus says, like, if you reject me before people, I will reject you. And do I hold people to that standard, even if it means they're going to die? Do I make them go to their death? And then when it's turned on him and he is confronted with, like, if you don't do this thing, if you don't apostatize, we will kill all these other people who are in your care, and they will be innocent victims of your stubbornness. That's kind of how it's framed to him. And his question is like, how do I care for the people who are under my care, under my supervision as a pastor? When you look at the movie through that lens, whether or not you agree with what Andrew Garfield did, I really think it helps people understand the position that clergy of all faiths, I would say, in America and throughout the world are in.
Yeah, I mean, my first thought coming off of that, Bob, is that, like, being a pastor is really tough in today's society. Like,
yes,
this might be facetious, but, like, it makes me think about how it seems like every year, at least once a year, some major news outlet will like write a long article about how evil the Catholic Church is. And there's part of me that reads those things and I'm like, do you not, like, understand the Catholic Church? Them not changing their position isn't anything new.
Right.
And in the face of, like, moments like that, I think about how hard it has to be to be a pastor or a priest or, some sort of minister in today's world where it's like, no, we've held these tenets for hundreds of years, and yet now they are being completely castigated for them. And then in the midst of that, where the culture is castigating them, their own flock has such wildly diverse opinions about how they ought to be pastoring and ministering to the congregation that it is just a recipe for burnout. There is massive, immense pressure from the outside, facing gargantuan pressure from the inside as well. And you're right, like you see that in Andrew Garfield, man. The way that the Japanese villagers who are Christians respond to them is like an overwhelming amount of pressure. Like we haven't been able to properly practice the faith in decades because no priests have been here, and now we're able to have our sins forgiven, and now we're able to do all these things. And at first you see Garfield like he's like all about it and energized by it. But by the end of the film, he has gone from being energized by the cool parts of being a minister to, like the suffering is brutal and I don't know if I can handle this.
Yeah. And I mean, like, Andrew Garfield doesn't have to worry about the kind of trivial things that we have to deal with in the American church of like, am I satisfying people's kind of consumer mentality? But in his, in what he's dealing with, it's amplified. It's turned up to 11 because he's dealing with life and death, literally. And like, what is my job here as a pastor? Is my job to make sure people are following like I don't want to say the letter of the law, but like, orthodoxy and right beliefs? Or is my job to do what I can to protect my flock? And that's ultimately like what the ending of this movie is about when he is confronted with the fumie, with like this very crudely carved image of Jesus and asked to step on it as a way of like stomping on Jesus. And what Scorsese and what Endo, the author of the book, has happened at the end of the story is that he hears the voice of Jesus calling to him and telling him to stomp. Like, this is what I came here for. I came to be stomped on by people. Like, it's okay. Go ahead and do it. And again, I'm not saying I agree with that, but I think what Scorsese does so brilliantly here is he doesn't just make the question of like, is it right or not to stomp on Jesus a question, but he puts you in the emotional state of Andrew Garfield, where it's like, all right, well, the alternative is like, if I don't stomp and I stand on my principles, then I really am responsible for the death of other people. And I love that there's just no easy answer to any of these questions. And they continue even after that climactic moment in the movie.
No, there's really no easy answers to it. I will say to kind of jump away from the moral quandary we're talking about for a second, I actually think that this movie was not graphic enough. There's part of me that, like, from the time Andrew Garfield is captured, the most graphic thing that they show in the movie is when the waves are overtaking the 3 Christians that they kill, who were the leaders of the church in that town. Yep. And outside of that, I don't know if this just sounds bad or not, but it doesn't feel like Garfield's crisis of faith is warranted by what you see on screen. And I don't know if that's just me. Maybe I'm desensitized by other more violent movies, but there's a part of me that feels like Scorsese focused so much of the camera work simply on Garfield that you didn't get the sense of the torture that the Japanese were putting these Christians through.
One thing that I really did like, though, is that Scorsese allows the camera and the scenes and the pacing to be so patient that it kind of demonstrates that, throughout church history, like, we really valorize the martyrs, right? Like, we really hold them up as like, wow, they got eaten by lions and like, what an incredible thing to do for your faith. But like, I think the question Scorsese asks is, all right, what would it look like to actually have to watch somebody be eaten by a lion? Like, it's not a simple thing. It's not a quick thing. There's no dignity to it. And Garfield's character talks about how that guy hung on that cross in the middle of the sea for like 5 days until he basically just starved to death. And it wasn't a quick thing. And as much as he wanted it to be a quick thing, it wasn't. And I think because of that, like, no, there's not that much kind of sudden, jarring violence in this movie. But because you see how undignified some of these deaths are, I do think it still has the impact that Scorsese intends it to.
Well, and that kind of brings me to my second point. I feel like the big problem that I have with this movie is like how hard Scorsese veers into the realm of gaslighting, where the way he portrays the Japanese is that they are just so manipulative, and they literally just keep telling Andrew Garfield, like, this is your fault that they're dying. This is your fault that they're suffering. And the whole time I'm just sitting there as an audience, like, saying, like, no, you're the one hanging these people upside down and cutting a little thing in their ears so that they don't pass out too quickly.
Right,
like,
right.
You're the one putting them out in the ocean to die. Like, there's no suffering that Andrew Garfield is causing to these people. Like, you are causing all the suffering. And for me, that just, I don't know, it took away from the impact of the movie for me. Did you feel like there's anything there?
No, not so much, because I feel like every time you can kind of come to a simplistic, and I don't want to call what you're saying simplistic, but like to an easy answer, there's something else in the movie that counters it. You know what I mean? That makes it more complicated. And for me, that thing is when he has that face-to-face with Liam Neeson. And Liam Neeson is basically saying, you know, you think that I'm a heretic and you think that I'm a bad person, but like, how do you know that what you're trying to teach these people is even really taking root? And he walks through kind of the like translational issues that from the very beginning, like we tried to teach people what the Son of God meant, and they thought we were talking about the sun in the sky. And then he says, like, I think he goes into like, do you even know what their word for God really means? And it's something, do you remember what it is? Like, I can't.
I don't remember at this moment.
But it's like something really trivial. And he's basically saying, like, these people were never worshiping God. They were worshiping you. If you want to do the right thing as somebody who is an object of their devotion, then protect them. And that's where I'm like, oh my gosh, this is not even a question of right doctrine or wrong doctrine. This is a question of like, if Liam Neeson's character is actually right about this, what would I do in that situation? And I think that's the thing that really, that I love about this movie. And Scorsese like goes in depth in this in interviews about the movie. He talks about how like his faith has evolved, quote unquote. And a lot of times that just means like, I don't believe what I used to believe. I want to find something that matches what I think should be the case. But for me, at least, what I will say is this. It is really easy to sit in a seminary classroom and learn about like what the right thing to believe is to make a system work. Because if one piece of the system falls apart, the rest of the system doesn't work. And so, you know, it's really, really easy to be like, oh my gosh, that person's a heretic. That person doesn't believe the right thing. I can't believe they're leading people astray with this, and this thought. And then you get out into the real world of like ministering to people and you realize I have not necessarily cracked open my systematic theology book in like 5 years because no one is asking me questions that are specifically related to what my thoughts on like Martin Luther and the response to the Reformation is. But B, like when you start dealing with the intricacies and the complexities of the real world, it's just not as black and white as it is when you're in college. And I think this is like a really good demonstration of me sitting in my like marble tower scoffing at all the feet on the ground who aren't doing it the right way. And then me getting out in the real world and being like, oh yeah, there's a lot tougher decisions at play that I wasn't factoring in.
See, I really struggle with that because for me, the scene with Liam Neeson was one of the least convincing scenes of the movie because he talks about how the faith hasn't taken root, that Japan is a swamp and nothing grows here. And I'm like, well, if that's like kind of the message that you're shooting for, then why did you show the faithfulness of the villagers in the outlying villages of the country? Because in my opinion, they are clearly not worshiping Garupe and Rodriguez. Like their faith would have dissipated long ago if they were just worshiping a priest. Mm-hmm. Like their faith is real and genuine. And so for me, like the position of the Japanese government and of Liam Neeson just feels patently wrong. Like, it is not true. It feels like, no, they just didn't like Christianity, so they are trying to stomp it out. For me, I never once in the movie got a sense of moral quandary of like, well, maybe the Japanese are right and it's a swamp and it can't grow. It's like, no, it very obviously grew.
Yeah.
And you stomped it out.
Oh, I agree. I think that, but what I really like about it, though, is that, do you remember when we did Do the Right Thing? And a lot of what we said was like, nobody really does the right thing in that movie.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of the same way here, except almost the inverse, where I think everybody has some bit of truth to what they're saying, but I can't trust anyone 100% in this movie. And when it comes to Garfield's character, like at the end of the movie, he apostatizes and you're like, oh man, he did it. And at first you're like, well, at least I kind of understand why he did it. And then they go into this really extended epilogue. And to your point about Scorsese, the dude knows how to do movie endings. The last 25 minutes of this movie are the best part.
They're like the exact opposite of the Return of the King ending. It's like the same. It keeps going on and on and on, but it just gets more and more depressing instead of more and more happy.
And more gray. Like there's more questions that arise. And the great thing about it is he doesn't dwell on any one of these scenes long enough for you to really like grapple with them. He's just like, and then this happened and that complicates things. And then this happened and this complicates things. And you find out that Andrew Garfield for, decades and decades basically ends up working for the Japanese government alongside Liam Neeson in like sniffing out Christian stuff and like throwing other Christians under the bus. But then every once in a while, you'll see that he kind of still believes this and he's smuggling an artifact here or there to Kichijiro or to the Japanese church. Is he still a Christian? Is he not still a Christian? Does he think that this is the best way to be a Christian by like publicly denying and then working in the background? But then he'll do something that seems so egregious that you're like, he can't really be a Christian. And man, I don't agree with most of what Andrew Garfield does at the end of this movie, but the questions still remain. Like, what is a Christian? Can you be a Christian while publicly denying that you're a Christian? It goes all the way back to the question of Peter denying Jesus 3 times. Do you have to be reconciled? Do you have to be restored publicly? Can you, with your final breath, like Andrew Garfield, like still be clinging to that cross and be considered a Christian? It's such a good ending to this movie, and it's questions that we'll never really be able to answer.
Yeah, but even with Peter, man, he said, like, Satan has asked to sift you like wheat, but when you have turned back, strengthen your brothers. And, like, Peter spends the rest of his life strengthening the brothers.
Yeah.
And I'm pretty sure he's the one that gets, or is it him or John that gets crucified upside down?
That was John. No,
John.
No,
yeah.
That was Peter. John dies of old age on Patmos.
That's right. Yeah. So, like, I don't know. I really struggle with the ending of this film. To me, it feels like maybe this is putting something on Scorsese that's not there. But it feels like the last 20 minutes of this movie are where Scorsese feels like he's at in his life.
I agree. It's definitely like, it's almost like wish fulfillment.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? And I found out in researching it too, that like that last moment of Rodriguez holding onto that cross in the barrel that's being burnt, that's a Scorsese insertion. Like that's not in the original text at all.
Yeah.
And I think it's very telling that Scorsese still wants to be able to believe that Rodriguez is a Christian and that he can hold these things near and dear to his heart while publicly denying them. And you're 100% right. I think it says more about Scorsese than it says about even the characters in the movie.
Yeah, and that's the struggle I have with this film. I don't know. I've been reading C.S. Lewis lately and reading a set of his essays in a book called The Way to Glory. And in this one essay, well, I mean, it was a speech that he gave in the middle of World War II. He's talking to a bunch of pacifists about why C.S. Lewis, is not a pacifist. And he talks about how, in his opinion, like, one of the biggest struggles with the pacifist position is that the greatest evil is suffering and death. and he just can't find proof that suffering and death are truly the greatest evil a person can experience. And I feel like this movie is completely based on this question of like, is suffering and death the worst thing that can happen to a person? Actually, let me rephrase that. It's not based around that question. It assumes that as the underlying principle, that suffering and death is the worst thing that can happen to a person. Therefore, you should apostatize to prevent suffering and death from happening to other people. And like Lewis would just flat out disagree with that. And I am nowhere near the intellectual giant that C.S. Lewis is. So I don't know, man. I think this movie is fascinating, but I'm wondering if the very premise of the movie is a little bit flawed.
I mean, I do think that it's important for us to acknowledge, and like, obviously, if you've listened this long in the podcast, you know that like Brad and I obviously went to seminary. We are both in some capacity like pastoring people, and we believe this stuff. Like, we are Christians. Reading reviews of this movie from atheists is, I think, really enlightening too, because like to them, they're like, this is a no-brainer. Why wouldn't you just step on the thing? And so it really does kind of depend on the lens that you're looking at this movie from. And I would just ask that anyone who's hearing our take on it understand that the worldview that we're coming from is like, hey, we believe this stuff. We're actually in the same boat as the missionaries in this movie. And so the struggle for us is the same struggle that they're going through. And when you look at it as an outside observer and you're like, oh yeah, this is a no-brainer, I think it simplifies it a little bit too much.
Man, Bob, you know what we should have done?
What's that?
We should have found a token atheist to have on the podcast.
A token atheist. Man,
that's what we should have done to get the opposing view on Silence.
Brad, I think it's time for final scores, man. This is a hard movie to rate, and it gets back to like the how do you capture Christianity on film discussion that we keep kind of circling, and we still haven't done that bonus episode yet. But this isn't like a God's Not Dead, which is just a crap movie. Like, but it's also very different to me than like Passion of the Christ, which I think now with almost 20 years of distance, I can look back on Passion of the Christ and be like, this was used as a pretty important tool for people to see like violence and like what can happen to the human body when it's tortured. And when you believe that that's Jesus, it's a very effective tool, but also like, it's not really a great movie. And I think I'm like, okay saying that now. This is different than that because I think this is just a much better made film, and it asks more challenging questions than Passion of the Christ did. But it falls into that same boat where it's like, we do believe this stuff. So like, can you evaluate the movie as a film? And I think as a film, I'm going to give it an 8.5 out of 10. It's not a perfect movie, but it has a lot going for it. And obviously like we have been very affected by it.
I'll just flat out say, like, as Mokichi died in the waves, I was weeping. Like, I don't think I could watch this movie without weeping as I look at his sacrifice for, our Lord, Jesus Christ. Like, that gets me, but you're right, Bob. It gets me because I believe in this stuff. Right. Because I'm down with it.
Yeah. I found a really cool little tidbit that after watching this movie, Terrence Malick, the director of The Tree of Life, also a very, Christian heavy themed movie, wrote a letter to Scorsese. And he said this in his letter. He said, "One comes away wondering what our task in life is. What is it that Christ asks of us? And what new shapes will he assume in these dark times, like those of old? He might appear, as you show, even in those who oppose the faith or betray it, like Judas or Pilate. His love seems to be wider for it." And, he's calling back to the character of Kichijiro. But I just love that Malick is even struggling with, like, I saw this movie, I don't know what to make, like, what is Jesus actually asking us to do? And that's the point of the movie.
Yeah. Yeah. What would Christ have for us in this broken world? And that's a really hard question, Bob. As you said, like jumping into the real world of ministering to people and caring for them in times of struggle and darkness and brokenness. The question, like, what does Jesus have for me in this? What would he have me do? what kind of a person would he have me be? That's a really hard question, and it's a really important one to struggle with for anyone who considers themselves a follower of Christ. I think as far as the movie Silence goes, I think I'll give it an 8 out of 10, Bob. There's a lot of issues that I have with it beyond just the philosophical stuff going on. It is wildly slow paced, and I like that it does that, but it's still slow, and I'm going to dock it a little bit for that. I wish that Adam Driver was the lead. I wish that they had good accents. There's definitely a few things going on here, but overall, it's still Scorsese. Scorsese is just like the master of the mic drop. Like, he hits the end of his movie, drops the mic, and is like, yeah, think about that for the next 3 months.
Right.
Like, he does that with every movie. He does it with Silence. So it's still an incredibly well-made film. Just not my favorite Scorsese, but still really good.
But we want to know what you think. You've listened to us talk about it for over an hour now, so if you've seen Silence, we want to hear your opinion on it. You can find us on social media, on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram, @FilmWhiskey.
Or you can jump onto our Discord. We are on there every single day talking about movies, whiskey, cigars, all sorts of things. You can join us by clicking the link at the end of every one of our show notes.
All right, next week we are really steering out of this kind of conversation, and we're steering into the world of filmmaker Edgar Wright. We're going to do 3 movies by him, kicking off with his 2004 classic, Shaun of the Dead. Brad, I'm really excited for that one. Cannot wait to talk about that movie. But until then, I'm Bob Book.
I'm Brad G.
And we'll see you next time.